They said the fallen king was a monster, a bloodthirsty beast meant to rot in the frozen courtyard. No one dared to step near his heavy iron cage. But Bridget, a crippled kitchen maid with absolutely nothing to her name, did not see a monster in the dark. Risking the hangman's noose, she snuck past the drunken guards in the dead of winter. She brought him a stolen crust of bread and a trembling, beautiful lullaby. She thought the captive sovereign was completely unconscious, deaf to the brutal world around him. She did not know that in the absolute, freezing darkness, his piercing amber eyes were wide open. And the most dangerous man in the northern valleys was memorizing every single note of her voice. The stone floors of the great keep were always damp, leaking a cold that settled deep into Bridget's bad leg. Every morning began the same way, long before the sun cleared the eastern, jagged ridges of the mountains. She would drag her stiff left foot across the kitchen, her arms aching from the weight of the iron water cauldrons. Mistress Martha, the head cook, was already stoking the massive hearth, her face flushed red from the premature heat. "Faster, girl," Martha grunted, not looking up as she hacked through a slab of salted pork. "The Lord Usurper wants his broth thick with barley before the morning watch changes." Bridget did not reply, for she had learned long ago that silence was her safest shield in this castle. She merely nodded, pulling her stained wool shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, and went back to scrubbing the grease from the heavy roasting spits. The castle had changed 3 moons ago, when Lord William brought his mercenary army through the western gates under the cover of a storm. King Robert, the sovereign who had ruled the northern valleys with a fierce but just hand, had been betrayed by his own captains. The stories whispered among the scullery maids said the king fought like a trapped bear, taking a dozen men down before the iron nets caught him. Now, he was no longer a king in the eyes of the court, but a trophy of William's sudden, bloody victory. They had not executed him, choosing instead a cruelty that Bridget found harder to stomach than a clean strike of an axe. They built a massive cage of thick black iron bars right in the center of the northern courtyard, fully exposed to the bitter mountain winters. Every day, the lords and ladies would look down from the covered high galleries, mocking the fallen ruler as he sat in the filth and the snow. "He hasn't touched the swill the guards threw him yesterday," Martha said, tossing a handful of coarse salt into the pot. "Let him starve, then," an older stable hand replied, leaning against the kitchen doorway to warm his hands. "Lord William wants him broken before the spring execution, but the man is made of iron." Bridget kept her eyes lowered, her brush moving in steady, rhythmic circles against the stone basin. Her heart twisted with a strange, quiet ache whenever she heard the servants speak of the prisoner in the yard. She knew what it was to be treated like an animal, to have scraps thrown at your feet, and to be reminded every hour of your worthlessness. That evening the castle was louder than usual, celebrating the anniversary of William's first successful campaign in the southern marches. The great hall roared with the sound of drunken laughter, heavy pewter mugs slamming against oak tables, and the screech of poorly tuned lutes. In the kitchens, the work was frantic, but by midnight, the exhaustion had claimed most of the staff. Martha had fallen asleep in her large wooden chair by the dying embers, snoring loudly with an empty jug of spiced ale at her feet. Bridget stood alone by the back pantry, her fingers trembling slightly as she looked at a small basket on the shelf. Inside lay a single, dense loaf of dark barley bread, forgotten by the bakers during the evening rush. It was hard, and it would likely be moldy by tomorrow, but to a starving man, it was life. She did not think about the consequences, or what Lord William's guards would do to a crippled maid caught stealing from the larder. She only thought of the shadow she had seen through the high window earlier that afternoon, a massive, slumped figure shivering under a layer of frost. Bridget reached out, tucked the heavy loaf into the deep pocket of her apron, and slipped out through the scullery door into the dark. The winter air hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her bad leg throb with instant fire. She kept close to the rough stone walls, pulling her dark cloak over her head to blend with the midnight shadows. The northern courtyard was usually guarded by 4 men, but tonight, the celebration had made them careless. 2 of the guards were slumped against the stone well, snoring heavily with their halberds resting uselessly against their shoulders.
A third guard was missing entirely, likely seeking warmth in the lower barracks or the arms of a tavern maid. Bridget held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she limped past the sleeping men. The iron cage stood in the center of the open square, looking like a monstrous black monolith under the pale, watery moonlight. The wind howled through the iron bars, whistling a bleak, lonely tune that made the hair on Bridget's neck stand up. As she drew closer, the sheer size of the prisoner became apparent, even in his defeated, hunched posture. King Robert sat on the frozen stone floor of the cage, his long, dark hair matted with dirt and dried blood from an old head wound. His hands were bound in heavy iron manacles, connected by a thick chain to a ring bolted deep into the center of the platform. He wore only a tattered wool tunic, his bare legs covered in dark bruises and the red marks of severe frostbite. Bridget stopped 10 paces away, suddenly terrified by the raw, dangerous aura that still clung to the man despite his chains. He did not move, his chin resting against his chest, his breathing so shallow that for a terrible second she thought he had frozen to death. "Your Grace?" she whispered, the words barely carrying over the whistling wind. There was no response from the dark figure, no twitch of a finger or shift of his massive shoulders. Bridget knew she couldn't get any closer. The iron bars were too close to the guard's line of sight if one of them happened to wake. She knelt behind a large stone pillar that supported the upper gallery, her hands trembling as she pulled the barley bread from her apron. She slid the loaf across the icy flagstones, watching it glide smoothly until it bumped against the bottom bars of the cage, right near his bare feet. The prisoner did not look down, his stillness absolute like a statue carved from the mountain itself. Bridget looked at him, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow that she couldn't explain to herself. She wanted to offer some comfort, something more than just a hard piece of bread that he might not even have the strength to reach. Without thinking, she leaned her head back against the cold stone pillar and closed her eyes. She began to sing, her voice low and soft, pitching it just loud enough to cut through the freezing draft, but quiet enough to escape the ears of the guards. It was an old northern ballad her mother used to sing to her when she was a child, a song about the spring thaws and the green hills of the high valleys. The melody was simple, carrying a melancholic beauty that seemed to soften the harsh, brutal reality of the stone courtyard. Her voice was the only beautiful thing she possessed, a pure, clear soprano that she usually kept hidden from the cruel world around her. As the first verses drifted through the iron bars, a subtle change occurred within the cage. The prisoner's breathing shifted, becoming deeper, steadier, though his body remained perfectly still to any casual observer. Robert's eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his tangled hair, slowly opened. They were a piercing, fierce amber, bloodshot from exhaustion, but burning with an intense, sharp intelligence that his captors believed they had extinguished. He listened to the girl's voice, each note striking against the cold walls of his chest like a spark on flint. For 3 months he had heard nothing but the jeers of traitors, the clink of chains, and the mocking laughter of the usurper. This voice was different. It held no pity that weakened him, nor the malice that sought to break him. It was simply a pure fragment of the home he had lost, delivered by a shadow hiding behind a stone pillar. Bridget finished the 3rd verse, her throat dry from the cold air, her body shivering violently from the prolonged exposure. She stood up quickly, her bad leg nearly buckling under her weight as she took one last look at the cage. The bread was still there, untouched, and the king had not moved an inch. Disappointment gathered in her chest, but she knew she could not stay a moment longer. The sky in the east was beginning to turn a dull, bruised gray. She turned and limped back toward the kitchen doors as fast as her frail body would allow, slipping inside just as the morning bell began to toll. Behind her, in the courtyard, the massive hand of the prisoner slowly reached out from the darkness. Robert's fingers, thick and calloused, clamped around the hard loaf of barley bread and pulled it into the shadows of his cloak. His amber eyes remained fixed on the empty stone pillar where the girl had stood, memorizing the shape of the shadow that had brought him music. He bit into the hard bread, his jaw clenching as he swallowed the dry food, feeling the first spark of warmth in his belly for weeks. The guards would wake soon, and the torment would begin anew. But something had changed in the freezing courtyard. The Iron Lion was no longer waiting to die. He was listening for the return of the night. The harsh winter deepened, burying the great keep under 3 feet of unrelenting snow and ice. Inside the cavernous kitchens, the heat from the massive hearths did little to chase away the bone-deep chill that haunted the stone floors. For Bridget, the days bled into a blur of grueling labor, bruised knees, and the sharp, stinging slaps of Mistress Martha's wooden spoon. The Lord Usurper, William demanded constant feasting to keep the loyalty of his mercenary captains warm, which meant the fires never died and the scullery maids never rested. Yet amid the soot and the sweat, a dangerous new rhythm had taken root in Bridget's bleak existence. Every night, long past the hour of the wolf, she would wait for the heavy snoring of the older servants to fill the servants' quarters. Then she would slip out into the frozen, malevolent winds of the northern courtyard. She never came empty-handed. Sometimes it was only a half-eaten carrot snatched from the pig swill, other times a wedge of stale goat's cheese that the high lords had deemed too hard to chew. She would slide these meager offerings across the ice-slicked flagstones, watch them hit the iron bars of the cage, and retreat to her stone pillar. Then she would sing. She sang ballads of ancient kings, laments of lost sailors, and lullabies meant for cradles she would never have the chance to rock. She sang until the frost bit at her lips, until her bad leg throbbed with a sickening rhythm, and until the eastern sky threatened to turn gray. Inside the cage, King Robert remained a silent, unmoving shadow. To the guards who taunted him during the day, poking him with the butts of their spears, he was a broken man waiting for the hangman's noose. They did not see the sovereign mind that still worked beneath the matted hair and the dirt, calculating distances, counting the guard rotations, and observing the weaknesses in the iron wrought around him. They also did not know that his survival was no longer solely fueled by the burning desire for retribution. It was fueled by a crippled kitchen maid. Robert had commanded armies of 10,000 men, faced down charging cavalry, and sat upon a throne forged from the swords of his ancestors. He knew loyalty bought with gold, and he knew loyalty earned through blood. But he had never known this strange, reckless devotion from a creature so incredibly fragile. He tracked her arrival each night, not by sight, but by sound. He learned the uneven, dragging scrape of her left foot against the snow, a rhythm that caused a strange, tight knot to form in his broad chest. He caught the scent of her before she even spoke, a humble mixture of wood smoke, old wool, and the faint, sweet smell of baking yeast. She never asked him for anything. She did not demand promises of land or gold for when he reclaimed his throne, for she clearly believed he never would. She simply fed him, offered him the staggering beauty of her voice, and vanished before the light could expose her face. He ate whatever she brought in slow, deliberate bites, savoring the stale crusts of bread as if they were roasted venison. Her food kept his muscles from wasting away entirely, but it was her voice that kept the crushing madness of the abyss at bay. In the absolute darkness of his captivity, her singing was a solitary thread of light, a reminder that the world outside his iron bars was still worth fighting for. By the end of the second week, the strain of her secret life began to show on Bridget. The dark circles under her eyes bruised her pale skin, and her hands shook as she hauled the heavy water buckets from the well. The scarcity of food in the castle was worsening as the siege-like winter held, making the kitchen staff fiercely protective of every scrap. It happened on a Tuesday. During the frantic preparation for a midday banquet, Mistress Martha had turned her back to check a roasting boar, leaving a cutting dish scattered with trimmings of salted beef. Bridget saw a thick cut of meat near the edge, discarded because it was mostly tough sinew. Without thinking of the risk, she swiped the scrap and shoved it deep into the pocket of her coarse apron. She wasn't fast enough. "You thieving little rat!" Martha roared, spinning around with a heavy iron ladle raised high. The blow caught Bridget on the shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down her arm and throwing her off balance. Because of her weak leg, she could not catch herself, and she fell hard against the jagged stone edge of the washing basin. Her right knee struck the floor with a sickening crack, tearing the fabric of her dress and ripping the skin wide open. Bridget gasped, curling in on herself as a hot, blinding pain flared through her leg. "Steal from the Lord's table alone, and I'll have the guards chop off your fingers," Martha spat, stepping over her without a second glance. "Get up and scrub the floors, now." Dodget bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, forcing herself to swallow the tears that threatened to fall. She dragged herself up, her knee bleeding freely down her shin, and returned to her scrubbing, the salted meat still hidden safely in her pocket. That night, the journey to the courtyard felt like a death march. The wind was vicious, carrying sharp particles of ice that sliced against her exposed cheeks. Every step she took sent a violent jolt of agony, radiating from her injured knee up to her hip. By the time she slipped past the sleeping guards and reached her sanctuary behind the stone pillar, she was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. She pulled the piece of salted beef from her pocket, her fingers stiff and blue from the cold. With a trembling hand, she slid the meat across the icy floor toward the cage. It stopped just short of the iron bars. Bridget closed her eyes, leaning heavily against the rough stone pillar, trying to summon the strength to sing. She opened her mouth, but the first note of the old northern ballad emerged as a broken, shivering croak. She cleared her throat, trying again, but the pain in her leg and the freezing air made her chest seize. A quiet sob escaped her lips, a pathetic, miserable sound that echoed loudly in the silent, frozen courtyard. She covered her mouth with both hands, terrified that the guards would hear her crying. Inside the cage, the heavy iron chains rattled. The sound was sharp and sudden, cutting through the howling wind like a crack of thunder. Bridget froze, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she stared at the dark monolith. For 14 nights, the king had not made a single sound, nor moved a single inch while she was present. Now, the massive shadow was rising. Robert stood up slowly, his sheer size terrifying as he uncoiled his battered body from the floor of the cage. He towered over 6.5 feet tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the faint moonlight that managed to pierce the snow clouds. The heavy manacles around his wrists clanked loudly as he walked slowly toward the front of the cage, the chain dragging against the stone. He stopped right at the bars, close enough that the wind carried the harsh, feral scent of his unwashed body and the metallic tang of dried blood. Bridget pressed herself flat against the pillar, paralyzed by a sudden primal fear. She had forgotten that he was not just a tragic figure in a cage. He was the Iron Wolf, the most lethal warrior the northern lands had ever seen. He reached down through the bars, his massive hand scooping up the piece of salted beef she had dropped. He did not eat it. Instead, he gripped the flake iron bars of his cage, his knuckles turning white as he leaned his face into the meager light. His amber eyes locked onto the dark space behind the pillar, staring with an intensity that seemed to strip away the shadows hiding her. "You are bleeding," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, rusted from disuse and thick with a commanding authority that sent a shiver straight down Bridget's spine. It was not a question, nor was it a gentle observation. It is a statement of fact laced with a dark, simmering anger that was entirely focused on her pain. Bridget opened her mouth, but no words came out. She gripped the edges of her cloak, staring at the fierce, unbroken sovereign standing just a few yards away. "They hurt you," Robert continued, his voice dropping an octave, sounding more like the growl of a predator than the speech of a man. He shifted his grip on the iron bars, the muscles in his thick arms flexing so hard the rusted metal groaned in protest. "Show yourself, little bird," he commanded, the rough edge of his tone softening just a fraction, making it a plea wrapped in an order. "Let me see the one who feeds a dead king." The biting wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving a suffocating silence in the courtyard. Bridget remained pressed against the rough stone of the pillar, her chest heaving as panic seized her throat. To revere herself was to step out of the only safety she had ever known in this brutal castle. Yet, the voice of the captive king possessed an inescapable gravity, drawing her forward against every instinct that screamed at her to run. Her fingers slowly released their white-knuckled grip on her tattered cloak. With a trembling breath, she dragged her injured leg forward, stepping out from the concealing veil of the shadows and into the pale, watery moonlight. She stopped just a few feet away from the heavy iron bars, clipping her head bowed, unable to meet his eyes. The sheer difference in their physical existence was staggering, painted in sharp relief by the moon. Even hunched over and bound in heavy chains, King Rodert was a mountain of muscle and scarred flesh, radiating a formidable, dangerous heat. Bridget, in contrast, looked like a fragile twig that a single gust of the winter storm could snap in two. She was pitifully small, her shoulders bosom beneath the thin wool, her posture warped by a lifetime of hard labor, and her crippled leg. Robert did not speak immediately. His amber eyes swept over her, taking in the bruised hollows of her cheeks, the dirt on her pale face, and the violent shivering that racked her tiny frame. His gaze finally dropped to her right knee, where a dark, wet stain of fresh blood was steadily blooming through the torn fabric of her coarse skirt. "Look at me," Robert commanded, his voice softer this time, but carrying a weight that demanded absolute obedience. Bridget flinched, but she slowly raised her chin, her wide, frightened eyes finally meeting his. She expected to see the madness of a broken man, or the cruel arrogance of the high lord she served in the great hall. Instead, she saw a profound, ancient sorrow mixed with an anger so cold and absolute it made her forget the freezing temperature. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his heavy jaw tight as he pointed a massive, chained finger toward her bleeding leg. "It was a fall, Your Grace," Bridget whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound in the dark. "I slipped on the wet stones." "Do not lie to me, little bird," Robert replied, the low rumble of his voice vibrating through the iron bars. "I have spent my life reading the wounds of soldiers." He gripped the bars tightly, his broad chest rising and falling with a steady, calculated rhythm. "That is no scrape from a clumsy fall," he stated plainly. "You were pushed, or you were struck. Who was it?" Bridget shook her head, terrified of what this caged giant might do, or what his anger might provoke. "It did not matter," she murmured, taking half a step back. "I am just a scullery maid. It is the way of things." "It is not the way of my kingdom," Robert growled, the heavy chains rattling as he shifted his immense weight closer to the edge of the cage. He looked at her ruined knee again, and a muscle feathered in his tight jaw. Without another word, Robert reached toward his own chest, taking hold of the collar of his tattered, filthy tunic. With a sudden, violent jerk of his thick arms, he tore the heavy fabric straight down the middle. Beneath it, he wore a thin undershirt of spun linen, gray with age but relatively clean compared to the rest of his garments. He gripped the hem of the linen shirt and ripped a long, broad strip of the fabric free. The sound of tearing cloth was loud in the quiet night, making Bridget flinch once more. Robert balled the strip of linen in his large hand and tossed it through the gap in the iron bars. It landed softly on the snow, right at Bridget's mismatched, broken boots. "Bind it," he ordered, watching her intently, "before the cold sets the rot into your blood." Bridget stared at the cloth, her mind struggling to comprehend the gesture. This was a man who had been stripped of everything, freezing in a cage, yet he was destroying his only layer of warmth for her. "I cannot take this, Your Grace," she whispered, a sudden hot sting of tears welling in her eyes. "You will freeze." "I have survived winters that would crack stone," Robert said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bind the wound, now." Slowly, carefully, Bridget knelt onto her good knee, wincing as the movement pulled at her battered flesh. She picked up the linen strip. It still held the faint, surprising warmth of his skin. With shaking hands, she wrapped the fabric tightly around her bleeding knee, tying it into a secure knot, just as Mistress Martha had taught her to truss a roast. The pressure immediately stopped the bleeding, and the clean cloth offered a small, comforting heat against the stinging air. "What is your name?" Robert asked, his eyes never leaving her hands as she finished the knot. "Bridget," she answered, rising clumsily to her feet, leaning her weight heavily on her good leg. "Bridget," he repeated, the syllables rolling slowly off his tongue as if he were carving them into the back of his mind. He let go of the iron bars, stepping back into the deeper shadows of his cage, but his amber eyes remained fixed on her face. "Listen to me closely, Bridget," Robert said, his voice dropping into a register of deadly, calm certainty. I am a man with nothing left to give and no throne to sit upon. He raised his manacled hands, letting the heavy iron chains clash together in a grim display of his captivity. But I swear to you by the old gods of the northern mountains, he continued, the absolute conviction in his tone sending a shiver through her. The one who made you bleed will not live to see the next winter. Bridget gasped, stepping backward, overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated danger radiating from the prisoner. She did not want anyone killed. She only wanted to survive the kitchen and keep the darkness from consuming this fallen king. Before she could form a reply, the heavy iron bell in the high watchtower began its slow, mournful toll. It was the signal for the changing of the guard. The castle was beginning to wake.
Go, Robert commanded sharply, turning his back to the wind. Do not let them see you. Bridget turned and hurried away as fast as her ruined leg could carry her, melting back into the shadows of the great keep. She slipped through the scullery door just as the heavy boots of the morning patrol echoed on the courtyard stones. When the sun finally breached the mountain peaks, casting a pale, cold light over Blackrock Castle, the guards marched out to mock their prisoner. They carried long wooden pikes, expecting to find the former king huddled on the frozen floor, half dead from the night's blizzard. Instead, they stopped short, exchanging uneasy glances. King Robert was not sitting in the filth. He was standing squarely in the center of the cage, his massive legs braced apart, his broad back straight despite the heavy iron binding his wrists. His matted hair blew wildly in the morning wind, but his face was carved from granite. When the captain of the guard stepped forward to taunt him, the words died in his throat. Robert was looking down at them not as a defeated captive, but as a sovereign, observing a courtyard full of dead men. Throughout the long, freezing day, Robert did not speak, nor did he react to the rotten food they threw at him. His mind, previously trapped in a numb, stagnant void of despair, was now operating with terrifying clarity. He walked the perimeter of his cage slowly, measuring the exact distance between the iron bars with the width of his shoulders. He dragged his chains across the floor, secretly testing the rusted bolts that anchored the iron ring to the stone platform. He counted the seconds it took for the guards to walk their perimeter, memorizing their blind spots and their moments of lethargy. The Lord Usurper believed he had broken the Iron Wolf by taking away his army, his banner, and his pride. But William had made a fatal miscalculation. He had left the beast alive in the dark, and a crippled servant girl had just given the beast a reason to break the cage. A false thaw arrived at Blackrock Castle just as the harsh winter month drew to a close. The heavy snowbanks piled against the high stone walls began to weep, turning the outer courtyards into treacherous seas of gray, freezing mud. Despite the slight break in the bitter frost, a suffocating tension settled over the great keep. Lord William, the usurper who now sat upon the stolen throne, was a man ruled by his own mounting paranoia. He knew that the melting snows would soon clear the mountain passes, opening the roads for trade, travel, and potential rebellion. As long as King Robert drew breath in the iron cage, William's claim to the northern valleys remained fragile and hollow. Bridget felt the shifting mood of the castle most acutely in the suffocating heat of the kitchens. The demands for heavy feasts increased, as if Lord William believed he could drown his captain's hidden doubts in rivers of spiced wine and roasted meats. Bridget worked from the moment the roosters crowed until the hearth fires burned down to dying embers. Her knee, bound tightly in the linen torn from the king's own back, was healing slowly, but it left her with a pronounced, painful limp. She scrubbed pots until her knuckles bled, keeping her head bowed and her eyes fixed firmly on the stone floors. It was during a chaotic supper service in the great hall that Bridget heard the words that made her blood run entirely cold. She was carrying a heavy silver platter of honeyed root vegetables toward the high table, stepping carefully to avoid the sprawling legs of drunken mercenaries. Lord William sat at the center of the dais, his face flushed with wine, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to his chief captain, Thomas. "I will not wait for the spring mud to dry," William hissed, slamming his heavy goblet onto the oak table. "The lords of the Eastern River are delaying their tax wagons. They are waiting to see if the wolf still has teeth." Captain Thomas leaned in closer, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. "The men are well paid, my lord. They will crush any peasant uprising." "I do not fear peasants,"
William spat, his eyes darting toward the high windows that looked out over the northern courtyard. I fear symbols, and the man in that cage is a symbol that refuses to die quietly. Bridget froze a few paces away, the heavy silver platter trembling slightly in her exhausted hands. Set the gallows in the main square, William commanded, his voice cold and resolute. We hang him on the night of the new moon, in the dark, so the sun does not shine on a dead king. The new moon. Bridget's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. That was less than a fortnight away. Move, girl, a harsh voice barked, and an impatient knight shoved her shoulder roughly. Bridget stumbled forward, hastily setting the platter on the edge of the table before retreating into the chaotic shadows of the serving corridor. Her mind was a whirlwind of sheer panic as she hurried back toward the safety of the scullery. They were going to kill him. The thought was like a physical blow to her stomach, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her vision swim. For the rest of the evening, she moved like a ghost, her hands performing their grueling tasks while her spirit remained trapped in the dark courtyard. When midnight finally tolled and the deep, exhausted silence claimed the servant quarters, Bridget did not hesitate. She slipped into the larder, her hands moving quickly in the dark, and managed to secure a half-eaten leg of roasted capon that had been tossed aside. She wrapped the meat in a clean cloth, tucked it deep into her apron, and stepped out into the freezing, damp night. The air smelled of wet stone and decaying ice, and a thick fog had rolled in from the mountains, swallowing the courtyard in a dense, blinding mist. The heavy fog worked in her favor, masking her limping approach and muffling the sound of her uneven footsteps. The guards were clustered around an iron brazier near the guardhouse, cursing the damp cold and completely ignoring the cage. Bridget moved silently from pillar to pillar until she reached her usual sanctuary nearest to the iron monolith. The cage was barely visible through the thick white mist, looking like the skeletal ribs of a massive, ancient beast. She did not need to sing tonight. Before she even reached into her apron, the heavy, rhythmic scraping sound ceased, and a massive shadow detached itself from the center of the cage. Robert moved toward the bars with a fluid, silent grace that defied his massive size and heavy chains. He had not spent the last week sitting idle in the freezing mud. Under the cover of the howling winds, he had been using a sharp fragment of Birken stone to methodically grind away the rust and iron around the main bolt of his chains. He stopped at the edge of the bars, his broad chest rising and falling slowly as he waited for her to step out of the fog. "You are breathing too fast, little bird," Robert said softly, his deep voice carrying through the mist like a distant rumble of thunder. Bridget stepped forward, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the cloth-wrapped meat as she offered it to him. Robert took the food, but his piercing amber eyes never left her pale, terrified face. "What has frightened you?" he asked, his tone shifting instantly from greeting to command. "The new moon," Bridget whispered, her voice cracking as a single hot tear spilled over her eyelashes and tracked down her dirty cheek. Robert stilled, his massive hands resting against the cold iron bars. "They have set the date," she continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "Lord William spoke of it at the high table. They are building the gallows in the main square." She expected him to roar in anger, or to slump in despair at the finality of his doom. Instead, the corners of Robert's mouth tightened, and a dangerous, predatory calm settled over his scarred features. 14 days, he murmured, calculating the time with a cold, terrifying detachment. "You must escape," Bridget pleaded, stepping closer to the bars, entirely forgetting her fear of the guards. "There must be a way to break the lock." "The lock is solid steel, forged by my own smiths," Robert replied, his voice even. "I cannot break it with my bare hands, nor with stone." "Then what will we do?" she asked, the word "we" slipping out before she could catch herself. Robert looked down at her, his amber eyes softening just a fraction at her unintended inclusion. He had commanded thousands who called him "my king," but this frail, broken girl standing in the freezing fog was the first to ever truly stand beside him. "We will do what must be done to survive," Robert said, leaning his face closer to the iron bars. "But I cannot do it alone, Bridget." He spoke her name like an oath, and the sound of it sent a strange, powerful warmth flooding through her shivering body. "Tell me what to do," she answered without a second of hesitation. Robert studied her face, seeing the sheer terror in her eyes, but also recognizing the unbreakable core of steel that had kept her alive in this hellish keep. "I need iron," he stated plainly, keeping his voice dangerously low. "A nail from the carpenter's bench, a heavy steel needle from the weaver's room, or a thick, sturdy bone skewer from your kitchens." He raised his manacled hands slightly, letting the thick chain pull tight against the center ring in the floor. "The bolt that anchors this chain to the stone is rusted deep beneath the surface. If I can drive a wedge into the collar, I can crack the iron housing."
Bridget stared at his heavy shackles, understanding the immense risk of what he was asking. If Mistress Martha caught her stealing food, she would be beaten. If William's guards caught her stealing iron to aid the prisoner, she would be tortured and hung from the highest tower before noon. "I will find it," Bridget said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper that surprised even herself. Robert reached his massive hand through the iron bars, stopping just inches from her face. He did not touch her, but the sheer heat radiating from his calloused skin was a physical presence against her cold cheek. "If they suspect you, Bridget," he warned, his eyes burning with a dark protective fire, "you drop it. You play the crippled fool and you run. Do you understand me?" "I am careful, Your Grace," she replied, holding his gaze. "You are brave," he corrected her, his hand slowly pulling back into the shadows of the cage. "Braver than the lords who bent their knees to a traitor." The castle bell tolled the single, heavy strike of the first hour of morning. The fog was beginning to lift, and the voices of the night watch echoed from the outer wall. "Go," Robert commanded gently, "and bring me a weapon, little bird." Bridget nodded once, pulling her tattered cloak tightly around her shoulders, and melted back into the fading mist. Robert watched her vanish, his jaw locked in a grim, iron resolve. He had intended to reclaim his kingdom, to restore his honor and avenge his fallen loyalists. But as he tasted the roasted meat she had brought him, the cold calculations of a king were replaced by the absolute fury of a protector. He was going to break these chains. He was going to tear Blackrock Castle down to its foundations, and he was going to place the world at the feet of the girl with the dragging step and the song of the spring thaw. Time bled away in the damp, suffocating confines of Blackrock Castle. 10 days remained until the new moon. 10 days until Lord William's gallows would cast their long, final shadow over the northern courtyard. Bridget felt the countdown in the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her own pulse. Every sudden clang of a dropped iron pot, every heavy, marching footstep of a guard, sounded to her like the tolling of a funeral bell. She kept her eyes strictly lowered, scrubbing the vast wooden preparation tables with a desperate energy that left her thin muscles trembling. She was actively searching for salvation in a room built entirely for slaughter. A simple iron carpentry nail would snap instantly under the immense pressure of the king's heavy, rusted chains. She needed something forged, something designed to pry and pierce through brutal resistance. The castle armory and the blacksmith's forge were heavily guarded areas, completely inaccessible to a lowly scullery maid with a bad leg. Her only genuine hope lay within the chaotic, grease-stained domain of Mistress Martha's kitchens. The terrifying opportunity materialized on a bleak, gray Thursday afternoon. The castle hunters had dragged a massive, old forest bear into the lower stone pantries. The massive beast was entirely frozen stiff, requiring heavy, specialized steel tools to break down the dense muscle and thick bone. Martha bellowed orders from the hearth, sending the frightened butcher's apprentices scrambling for the heavy cleavers and marrow scoops. A thick, solid steel boning skewer, nearly a foot long and tapered to a brutal, armor-piercing point, was tossed carelessly onto a bloody side table. It was a crude, incredibly heavy instrument, slick with old tallow and deeply scarred from years of heavy use. Bridget saw it out of the corner of her eye, and her breath hitched painfully in her dry throat. It was exactly what the king had asked for. She waited, her back turned to the made hearth, pretending to sort a large basket of wrinkled winter apples. The kitchen was a deafening, blinding symphony of shouting voices, chopping blades, and roaring fires. Mistress Martha finally turned her massive back to inspect a boiling rendering vats of animal fat. Bridget did not hesitate for a single second. She moved with a desperate, silent speed, completely ignoring the sharp, tearing protest of her healing right knee.
Her hand darted out, her cold fingers closing tightly around the greasy, heavy steel handle of the skewer. She slid it instantly into the deep, heavy wool folds of her skirts, pressing it flat against her thigh. The cold, heavy metal bit through her thin undergarments, a shocking contrast to the suffocating, bloody heat of the kitchen. Just as she turned back to the apples, a heavy, grease-stained hand slammed down on the wooden table beside her. "Idle hands get burned, girl," an older cook snapped, shoving a massive pile of unwashed, dirt-crusted real vegetables to her. Prithgetu nodded, swallowing the massive lump of pure terror firmly lodged in her throat. For the rest of the grueling day, she worked with the heavy steel weapon pressing against her flesh. It bruised her leg badly with every limping step she took, serving as a constant, heavy reminder of the deadly treason she now carried. That night, the oppressive winter sky finally broke open. A torrential, freezing, pre-spring rainstorm washed violently over the mountain fortress. The fierce wind roared through the high battlements, tearing loose slates from the roofs and driving solid sheets of icy water across the open courtyards. It was a miserable, punishing storm that drove every sensible guard into the deepest, warmest alcoves of the lower gatehouses. To Bridget, it was a profound, terrifying blessing. She slipped out of the heavy scullery door, immediately soaked to the bone by the driving, freezing rain. The mud in the courtyard was thick and treacherous, clinging heavily to her worn boots and pulling fiercely at her injured leg. She kept her head down, leaning heavily into the howling gale, fighting violently for every inch of forward progress. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the sporadic, jagged flashes of distant lightning over the eastern mountain ridges. She found her stone pillar entirely by memory, collapsing against the rough, freezing granite in sheer exhaustion. The rain battered her pale face relentlessly, blinding her and stealing the breath from her lungs. Before she could even gather herself to look for the iron monolith, a deep, resonant vibration caught her attention. It was not a sound, but a heavy feeling in the stone beneath her sodden feet. Robert was already waiting. He stood right at the edge of the thick bars, completely exposed to the violent, freezing downpour. The heavy rain washed the accumulated grime and dried blood from his broad, muscular shoulders, revealing the stark, jagged landscape of his old battle scars. He looked like a massive statue forged from the dark iron of the cage itself, an elemental force of nature standing entirely defiant against the storm. Bridget stepped out from behind the pillar, the wind nearly knocking her frail body completely sideways. She staggered toward the bars, her hands shaking violently as she reached deep into her sodden, heavy skirts. She pulled the heavy steel skewer free, offering it silently toward the dark silhouette of the fallen king. Robert reached his thick arm through the bars, his massive hand closing firmly over the center of the steel tool. In the darkness and the pouring rain, his thick fingers brushed directly against hers. It was the briefest, most accidental of contacts, yet it sent a sudden, shocking jolt through Bridget's freezing body. His skin was heavily calloused and rough, but unexpectedly, radiating a massive heat against her icy, trembling fingers. Robert froze instantly, his grip tightening hard on the heavy steel. He felt the terrible, violent shivering of the small, fragile hand beneath his own. "You are freezing," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut directly through the howling wind. He did not pee his massive hand away immediately, his thumb lingering for a fraction of a second against her frozen, bruised knuckles. "It is nothing, Your Grace," Bridget chattered uncontrollably, instinctively wrapping her thin arms around her chest. "It is a storm meant to kill livestock," Robert countered, his amber eyes narrowing sharply as he assessed her terrifyingly fragile state. He pulled the steel skewer smoothly into the cage, testing its heavy weight and balance in his large hand. It was a crude, ugly tool, but the steel was incredibly heavy and entirely unforgiving. It was exactly the weapon he needed to break his chains. "You have brought me the key to this iron grave, Bridget," he said solemnly, the rain dripping heavily from his square jaw. "Now go back to the fires before the cold stops your heart." Bridget shook her head slowly, a stubborn, quiet defiance flaring in her chest that she had never known she possessed. "The guards will not patrol in this weather," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her violent shivering. If they hear the metal striking, I can warn you before they reach the courtyard." Robert stared down at her, the distant lightning briefly illuminating the hard, uncompromising lines of his face. He saw the absolute terror in her wide eyes, but he also saw the terrifying, unyielding depth of her loyalty. She was actively offering to stand sentinel in a freezing tempest for a man she owed absolutely nothing to. "The sound of iron on steel will travel, even through the rain," Robert warned, his deep voice softening slightly.
"If you are caught near this cage, William will not show you the mercy of a quick death." "I know," Bridget replied simply, stepping carefully back into the deep shadow of her stone pillar. She did not leave. Robert watched her for a long, silent moment, a profound, heavy respect settling deep into his chest. He had fought alongside legendary knights who possessed half the raw courage of this crippled kitchen maid. He turned away from the bars, his heavy iron chains dragging loudly through the deep puddles accumulating on the stone floor. He knelt deliberately beside the thick, rusted iron ring bolted deep into the center of the platform. He positioned the sharp, hardened tip of the heavy steel skewer right into the tight, rusted seam of the main anchoring bolt. He wrapped his massive, scarred hands around the heavy iron chain itself, preparing to use a length of it as a makeshift, brutal hammer. He waited for the sky to light up again. A massive, deafening roll of thunder broke directly over the castle, shaking the very foundations of the ancient keep. In the exact moment the thunder roared, Robert brought the heavy chain crashing down viciously onto the blunt end of the steel skewer. The violent impact sent a bone-jarring shockwave up his thick arms, but the sharp steel bit deeply into the rusted iron seam. He waited, perfectly still, listening intently for any shout of alarm from the guard towers. There was nothing but the relentless, punishing roar of the downpour. Behind the stone pillar, Bridget kept her eyes fixed firmly on the distant guardhouse, completely ignoring the freezing rain turning her thin clothes to ice. She was no longer just a frightened, passive spectator hiding in the dark. She was an active participant in the coming ruin of Blackrock Castle. Every time the heavy thunder rolled, the sharp metallic crack of Robert's brutal labor echoed faintly in the flooded courtyard. It was the terrifying sound of a sleeping titan methodically breaking free from his iron chains. And Bridget, shivering violently in the freezing mud, stood absolute guard over the beast that would soon tear the world apart for her. The freezing rain of the pre-spring tempest exacted a brutal, unforgiving toll on a body already pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. By the dawn of the third day following the storm, a violent, consuming fever had completely taken hold of Bridget. She lay curled upon her thin, rotting straw pallet in the darkest corner of the servant quarters, shivering uncontrollably. Her pale skin burned with an unnatural dry heat, and every labored breath she drew rattled dully within her chest like crushed dry leaves. When the heavy morning bell tolled, demanding the castle awake for its daily labors, she fought a desperate internal battle to rise. Her overwhelming sense of duty fought against the crushing, suffocating weight of her illness. She managed to drag herself into a kneeling position, but her ruined leg buckled instantly beneath her. She crashed heavily onto the cold wooden floorboards, her vision swimming with dark, disorienting spots. Mistress Martha stood over her a moment later, her broad face an unreadable mask of hard, pragmatic contempt. "Leave her where she lies," the head cook ordered the other terrified watching maids. "If she cannot stand to carry the water, she cannot work, and I will not waste good mutton broth on a dying cripple." They abandoned her in the encroaching darkness, entirely alone in the freezing draft of the lower, neglected halls. As the daylight faded into a bleak, gray dusk, Dudget drifted in and out of a terrifying delirium. Her mind was not filled with fear for her own fading life, but with a frantic, consuming anxiety for the prisoner in the yard. She imagined the king waiting in the freezing mud, relying on the meager scrap of food she could no longer provide. She tried to call out to the other servants, to beg someone to carry a piece of bread to the courtyard, but her voice was gone. Only a dry, agonizing wheeze escaped her cracked lips as the relentless fever dragged her deeper into the abyss. Meanwhile, in the northern courtyard, the winter sky had cleared entirely, offering absolutely no clouds to hide the pale, sharp moonlight. King Robert sat completely motionless in the center of his iron cage, his broad shoulders squared against the biting wind. He was waiting patiently for the familiar, dragging rhythm of uneven footsteps on the icy flagstones.
The heavy steel skewer was hidden safely beneath his tattered cloak, alongside the partially destroyed iron housing of his main chain. He had worked silently and diligently for 3 consecutive nights, grinding away the ancient metal until only a fragile sliver of iron held him. Tonight was the night he had planned to sever the final bond, but he refused to move until his quiet sentinel arrived. The midnight hour passed slowly, marked by the deep, mournful strike of the high watchtower bell. Absolute silence reigned over the freezing mud of the courtyard, broken only by the distant, ignorant laughter of the guards. Robert shifted his immense weight, his sharp, predatory amber eyes scanning the deep shadows surrounding the stone pillars. The darkness remained entirely empty, devoid of the fragile shadow that had become his only tether to sanity. Another hour bled away into the freezing night, and a slow, creeping realization began to take firm root in his chest. She was not coming. In all the grueling weeks of his agonizing captivity through blizzards and extreme exhaustion, the little bird had never once missed her vigil. Robert suddenly remembered the violent, terrifying shivering of her fragile frame during the tempest. He recalled the shocking, lethal cold of her tiny hands when they had briefly brushed against his own thick fingers. The terrible, undeniable truth hit him with the devastating force of a swinging iron battle hammer. The storm had broken her entirely. A sudden, blinding wave of absolute fury washed over the fallen sovereign, eclipsing any rage he had ever felt toward his betrayers. Lord William could steal his ancient crown, slaughter his loyal armies, and strip him of his worldly honor without inciting this level of madness. But they had forced a broken, helpless girl to stand in the freezing rain to save a dead man, and now she was paying the ultimate price. The cold, calculating patience of a seasoned military commander vanished instantly from his mind. It was immediately replaced by the terrifying, primal wrath of the beast they called the Iron Wolf. Robert stood up, no longer caring if the careless guards noticed his sudden, towering presence in the moonlight. He grasped the heavy steel chain with both of his massive hands, wrapping the thick iron links tightly around his scarred knuckles. He planted his bare, heavily bruised feet firmly against the freezing stone platform, completely ignoring the sharp pain of his ruined skin. He brought the heavy steel skewer down directly into the deep, weakened fracture of the rusted floor anchor. He did not wait for the safe cover of thunder, nor did he look toward the distant guardhouse. He threw his entire massive weight backward, his thick muscles bulging impossibly against the strict confines of his skin. A sharp, deafening crack split the quiet air of the courtyard, a sound far louder and more lethal than the clash of steel swords. The ancient, rusted iron housing shattered completely, sending jagged, heavy shards of metal flying violently across the icy stone floor. The heavy chain snapped free from the floor at last, whipping through the cold air like a lethal iron serpent. Robert staggered back a single, heavy step, the immense momentum of his brutal effort tearing a deep gash across his own calloused palm. He did not feel the sharp sting of his own injury. He was no longer tethered to the stone floor of his prison. He was still tightly bound by the heavy iron manacles around his wrists, but the long, deadly length of chain was now his weapon. The sudden, violent noise echoed sharply against the high stone walls of the great keep. By the distant guardhouse, the 3 mercenaries immediately stopped their drunken laughing. They dropped their wooden flagons of ale, turning their heads sharply toward the dark, imposing monolith in the center of the yard. "What in the hells was that?" the youngest guard muttered, grabbing his heavy iron halberd from the stone wall. "Ice cracking off the roof," the oldest guard replied lazily, though he squinted his eyes toward the thick shadows of the cage. "Take a torch and whack the perimeter," the captain ordered, drawing his long sword with a sharp metallic hiss. The young guard lit a heavy pitch torch from the brazier, the bright orange flames casting long, dancing shadows across the muddy ground. He stepped carefully out into the open square, his boots sinking deeply into the freezing, treacherous slush. "Hey, animal!" the guard shouted nervously, holding the flaming torch high to pierce the deep gloom of the iron cage. "Are you throwing yourself against the bars again?" Robert stood perfectly still in the deepest corner of the shadows, deliberately winding the loose length of the heavy chain tightly around his wrapped forearm. He let his breathing slow into a steady, predatory rhythm, his amber eyes tracking the approaching guard with absolute, lethal focus. He was a sovereign of the high valleys, a warlord forged in the brutal fires of countless northern campaigns. He did not fear the sharp edge of a mercenary's sword, nor the numerical advantage of the usurper's entire garrison. He only feared the silence that currently emanated from the empty space behind the stone pillar. The guard took another hesitant step forward, the flickering orange light finally washing over the front iron bars of the cage. He looked down at the center of the platform, expecting to see the prisoner huddled brokenly on the freezing stone. Instead, he saw the violently shattered remains of the heavy iron anchor mechanism, surrounded by deep gouges in the flagstones. The guard's eyes went completely wide with pure, unadulterated terror, the breath catching sharply in his throat. Before he could even open his mouth to scream an alarm, a massive, muscular arm shot out through the narrow gap in the iron bars. Robert's large hand clamped violently around the heavy woolen collar of the guard's tunic, hauling him forward with terrifying, impossible strength. The guard crashed heavily into the unyielding iron bars, the sheer force of the impact instantly knocking the heavy torch from his grasp. He dangled helplessly in the king's grip, his feet lifting completely off the muddy ground. "You have stolen my kingdom," Robert whispered, his voice a dark, malevolent promise that echoed with absolute ruin. "You have stolen my armies, and you have mocked my imprisonment." The guard scrambled wildly at the massive hand choking him, his legs kicking uselessly against the cold iron of the cage. "But tonight," the fallen sovereign continued, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying, unholy retribution, "you have taken something far more valuable." Robert did not look at the dying man in his grip. He looked past him, toward the high, imposing walls of the main keep where his little bird lay dying. He would not wait for the new moon decree, nor would he wait for the warm winds of the spring thaw. The total, undeniable execution of Blackrock Castle had officially begun. The captive guard did not even have the time to draw his final breath. Robert's massive hand tightened with the sudden, undeniable force of a falling portcullis. There was a dull, sickening shift of bone, and the guard's desperate struggling ceased entirely. The sovereign let the lifeless body drop heavily into the freezing mud outside the iron bars. He reached through the narrow gap, his rough fingers expertly locating the heavy iron ring of keys secured to the dead man's leather belt. He tore the ring free with a sharp, violent pull that snapped the thick leather completely in half. Robert moved to the heavy iron door of the cage, his amber eyes fixed on the remaining two guards near the distant brazier. He found the largest key on the ring, sliding it into the ancient, rusted mechanism of the heavy lock. The mechanism turned with a loud, protesting screech that echoed through the entire northern courtyard. Robert kicked the heavy iron door outward with a massive thrust of his bare foot. The heavy metal door swung wildly on its rusted hinges, slamming against the outer frame with a sound like ringing a massive execution bell. The captain of the guard and the remaining mercenary finally registered the sheer catastrophe unfolding in the darkness. "The beast is loose!" the captain roared, raising his longsword and charging blindly toward the open cage. Robert did not retreat into the shadows, nor did he seek a weapon from the dead man at his feet. He stepped completely out of the iron enclosure, his bare feet sinking into the freezing, bloody mud of his own prison. He was fully exposed to the pale moonlight, a towering monolith of muscle, scarred flesh, and absolute, malevolent wrath. The heavy iron manacles still bound his wrists, but he now controlled the long, deadly length of the broken anchor chain. He swung his right arm in a wide, vicious arc as the captain closed the distance. The heavy iron link sliced through the cold air with a sharp, terrifying whistle. The heavy chain struck the captain squarely across the chest plate with the devastating impact of a charging warhorse. The heavy steel armor crumpled inward instantly, and the van was thrown backward through the air, landing in a lifeless heap near the stone well. The last remaining guard stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with absolute, paralyzing horror. He looked at the fallen captain, then looked up at the terrifying, unholy silhouette of the iron wolf advancing through the mud. The guard dropped his heavy halberd into the slush and turned to flee toward the safety of the inner keep. Robert did not pursue him, for a sovereign does not chase a fleeing coward. He simply reached down, lifted the discarded halberd with one massive hand, and hurled it forward with impossible, brutal precision. The heavy wooden shaft struck the fleeing man directly between the shoulders, dropping him silently into the frozen shadows. The northern courtyard fell into a deep, oppressive silence once more. Robert stood alone in the center of the square, inhaling his first deep breath of genuine, unchained air in countless moons. He looked up toward the high, illuminated windows of the great keep, where Lord William was likely sleeping off his heavy wine. The path to the royal chambers was clear, and the element of total surprise was currently his to command. He could take the throne room before the changing of the morning watch. Instead, Robert slowly turned his broad back away from the high towers of power. He looked toward the low, dark, unassuming archway that led deep into the castle's scullery and servant quarters. He remembered the uneven, dragging rhythm of a crippled leg and the faint, humble scent of wood smoke and baking yeast. He began to walk, the heavy iron chain dragging behind him, scoring a deep, permanent line in the frozen earth. He reached the heavy oak door of the lower kitchens, a portal meant to keep the misery of the servants hidden from the high lords. Robert did not bother searching for a handle or a key. He raised his right leg and drove his bare heel squarely into the center of the reinforced timber. The heavy iron hinges shattered instantly, and the massive door splintered violently inward, crashing onto the stone floor of the pantry. The deafening noise woke the exhausted kitchen staff immediately. Terrified screams erupted from the shadows as cooks and scullery maids scrambled blindly away from the destroyed entrance. Robert stepped into the suffocating, stale heat of the massive kitchens, his amber eyes adjusting instantly to the dim glow of the dying hearth fires. He looked like a nightmare summoned directly from the old northern myths. He was towering, filthy, and radiating a dark, lethal aura that sucked all the remaining air from the large room. Mistress Martha emerged from her sleeping alcove, clutching a heavy iron meat cleaver in her trembling hands. She opened her mouth to shout a command, but the words died completely in her throat as she recognized the massive intruder. "Where is she?" Robert demanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that rattled the copper pots hanging from the ceiling beams. Martha took a stumbling step backward, the heavy cleaver slipping slightly in her sweaty grip. "I do not know who you seek, demon," she stammered, her face draining of all color. Robert closed the distance between them in two massive, terrifying strides. He did not strike her, but simply reached out and caught the thick wooden handle of the cleaver she held. He squeezed his massive fist, and with a sharp twist of his thick wrist, he effortlessly tore the weapon from her grasp and tossed it into the hearth. "The girl with the bad leg," Robert stated, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calm. "Where does she sleep?" Martha pointed a trembling, fat finger toward the narrow, dark corridor that led to the lower servant barracks. Robert walked past her without another glance, his massive shoulders brushing against the heavy stone archway. The corridor was damp, entirely unlit, and reeked heavily of rotting straw and unwashed bodies. He navigated the oppressive darkness using only his heightened senses, his heavy footfalls echoing like a death knell in the narrow space. He reached the main sleeping quarters, a large, drafty room filled with closely packed wooden pallets. The other servants huddled in the far corners, pressing themselves flat against the damp walls in pure, unadulterated terror. Robert ignored them all, his amber eyes scanning the miserable room until they locked onto a tiny, still figure in the most neglected corner. He crossed the room, dropping heavily to his knees beside the rotting straw pallet. Bridget lay completely motionless, her small face terrifyingly pale in the gloom, save for the bright, unnatural flush of a lethal fever on her cheeks. Her thin, chapped lips were slightly parted, and her breathing was a shallow, desperate rasp that broke his heart. Robert reached out, his massive, calloused hand hovering hesitantly over her fragile face. He had ordered the slaughter of thousands without a second of hesitation, yet he was suddenly terrified of breaking this tiny girl. He gently pressed the back of his hand against her forehead, completely ignoring the grime and sweat coating her skin. She was burning with an extreme, lethal heat that radiated through her thin, tattered clothes. "Little bird," he whispered, the dark, malevolent sovereign sounding utterly devastated in the quiet room. Bridget did not stir, deeply trapped in the suffocating abyss of her illness. Robert looked down at her battered body, noting the thin, threadbare apron that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing drafts. He saw the dirty linen bandage still tightly bound around her ruined right knee, exactly where he had told her to tie it. A profound, suffocating sorrow washed over him, quickly followed by a cold, absolute resolve. He stood up, slowly, unfastening the heavy bronze clasp of his own dark, tattered woolen cloak. He stripped the garment from his broad shoulders, leaving himself entirely exposed to the freezing castle air in only his torn linen undershirt. He knelt back down, gently sliding his massive arms beneath her fragile, broken form. She weighed absolutely nothing, feeling no heavier than a bundle of dry winter kindling in his immense grasp. He lifted her with incredible, deliberate care, ensuring that her injured leg was fully supported against his thick forearm. He wrapped his heavy woolen cloak completely around her, cocooning her shivering body in the lingering heat of his own skin. He pulled the heavy fabric up securely around her face, shielding her entirely from the harsh environment of the miserable room. Bridget unconsciously leaned her burning cheek against the hard, solid muscle of his broad chest, letting out a faint, painful sigh. Robert stood at his full, terrifying height, cradling the tiny kitchen maid firmly against his heart. He turned toward the doorway, where Mistress Martha and the other terrified servants had gathered to watch the impossible scene. They looked at the Iron Wolf, expecting him to exact a bloody, merciless revenge upon the people who had tormented the girl. Robert stared at them, his amber eyes promising a retribution far worse than simple violence. "If her heart stops beating before the sun rises," Robert declared, his voice echoing with the absolute authority of a reigning king, "I will personally seal the gates of this castle, and I will burn it entirely to the ground with every soul trapped inside." He did not wait for their terrified weeping or their desperate pleas for mercy. He walked out of the dark, miserable servant quarters, holding his fragile savior tighter against his chest. He carried her out of the kitchens and back into the main corridors of the fortress. He was no longer a prisoner, nor was he simply a king seeking an empty crown. He was a protector walking out of the abyss, and he was taking his little bird to the high tower to claim the warmth she had always been denied. The stone corridors of Blackrock Castle were no longer a labyrinth of despair. They were simply a path for the Iron Wolf to tread. Robert carried Bridget against his broad chest, his pace steady and completely unhurried. Her shallow, ragged breathing was the only sound that mattered to him in the dark. He ignored the freezing draft that swept through the open archways of the lower levels. He felt only the unnatural, dangerous heat radiating from her small body through his woolen cloak. They encountered the first patrol near the foot of the grand staircase. 4 men in heavy mail armor stood blocking the wide stone steps, holding drawn swords. They froze when they saw the massive, half-naked man emerging from the lower shadows. Robert did not slow his stride. He did not even consider putting Bridget down on the cold stone. He simply shifted her weight entirely to his left arm, holding her securely against his heart. With his right hand, he unwound the heavy iron chain that still hung tightly from his wrist. The captain of the patrol shouted a command to attack, but his voice cracked with obvious terror. Robert swung the iron chain in a brutal, low arc. The heavy iron links struck the closest guard's wooden shield with the force of a battering ram. The thick wood splintered instantly into useless, jagged fragments. The guard was thrown backward up the stone steps, crashing heavily into his comrades. Robert stepped over their groaning bodies without breaking his steady rhythm. He left them bruised on the floor, too terrified to stand and pursue the fallen king. He reached the upper levels of the keep, where the air grew noticeably warmer. The stone floors here were covered with thick, expensive woolen rugs to soften the footsteps of the high lords. The wall torches burned brightly, casting a warm, golden light over the heavy tapestries. Robert hated these halls, knowing they were bought with the blood of his loyalists, but tonight they served a vital purpose. He needed the deepest, most secure heat the castle could possibly offer his fragile savior. He headed directly for the lord's private chambers at the end of the grand hall. 2 elite royal guards stood before the heavy oak doors, their long spears crossed to bar entry. They saw the dark blood on Robert's bare chest and the broken iron chains dragging heavily behind him. They dropped their weapons onto the rugs and ran for the stairwell. Robert did not blame them for their cowardice. He raised his bare foot and kicked the heavy double doors exactly at the center lock. The thick iron latch snapped loudly, and the doors flew open, hitting the stone walls with a deafening crash. Lord William was sitting up in his massive four-poster bed, clutching a silk sheet to his chest. The usurper's face was pale, his eyes wide with the sudden, impossible realization that his reign was broken. A terrified serving woman beside him scrabbled out of the bed and ran to the far corner of the room to hide. Robert ignored them both. He walked straight past the trembling usurper toward the center of the opulent chamber. The bed was a vulgar display of stolen wealth. It was piled high with expensive mountain furs, imported silk pillows, and thick velvet blankets. Robert stopped at the edge of the large mattress. He slowly lowered himself, bending his heavy knees to place his fragile burden onto the pristine sheets. He pulled his dark, dirty cloak away from Bridget's face with incredible, uncharacteristic gentleness. Her pale, soot-stained cheeks contrasted sharply with the white silk beneath her head. Her tattered, wet dress stained the expensive fabrics with kitchen grease and courtyard mud. Robert did not care about the ruin of the fine linens. He arranged the heavy furs closely around her small, shivering shoulders, tucking them in tightly to trap the heat. William finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely a frightened whisper. "How are you free?" the usurper asked, staring blindly at the broken chains still hanging from Robert's wrists. Robert turned slowly to face the man who had stolen his crown. He did not shout, nor did he roar in triumph. He walked toward a heavy iron stand near the roaring fireplace, where William's personal broadsword rested. Robert picked up the blade with his right hand. It was a beautiful weapon, perfectly balanced, but it felt light and useless compared to the iron chains he had dragged for months. He walked back to the bed and pressed the tip of the cold steel directly against the hollow of William's throat. The usurper swallowed hard, pressing his back flat against the carved wooden headboard. "Listen to me, William," Robert said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that filled the quiet room. "You will not call for your remaining guards, and you will not try to run." He pressed the sharp blade just a fraction deeper, breaking the skin enough to draw a single drop of blood. "You will send a runner to the lower bailey immediately. You will wake the castle physician. You will tell him to bring every warming draught, every root, and every healing herb he possesses." William nodded frantically, his eyes darting toward the tiny, dirty maid lying unconscious in his bed. For the servant?" he stammered, clearly billed by the king's demand. "For my savior," Robert corrected him, his amber eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "If she does not wake, William," Robert continued, his tone completely devoid of mercy, "I will not just take my throne back tonight. I will lock the doors of this hall, I will set the tapestries on fire, and I will watch you burn alive beside her." He pulled the sword away smoothly, pointing the bloodied tip toward the open hallway. "Call your healer. Now!" William scrambled out of the bed, entirely abandoning his dignity and his pride in his nightclothes. He ran into the hallway, shouting frantically for his servants to fetch the old maester. Robert dropped the stolen sword carelessly onto the floor. He pulled a heavy wooden chair to the side of the bed and sat down. He rested his massive, scarred forearms on the edge of the mattress, his amber eyes fixed intently on Bridget's pale face. He had broken the iron cage in the courtyard. He had effortlessly broken the usurper's courage in his own bedchamber. Now, he just had to wait and see if he could break the fever that threatened to tuck the only light he had left. The physician arrived less than 10 minutes later, breathless and clutching a heavy leather bag. He was an older man, his hands trembling as he saw the massive, fearsome figure of the true king sitting by the bed. "Approach," Robert commanded, not looking away from Bridget. The old man hurried to the opposite side of the bed, opening his bag with clumsy fingers. He placed a hand lightly on Bridget's burning forehead, his expression immediately turning grave. "Her lungs are heavily congested, Your Grace," the physician murmured. "The fever has taken deep root in her blood." "Cure it," Robert stated plainly. "Leave absolutely no room for failure. I will brew a strong willow bark tea to break the heat and mix it with crushed poppy to ease her breathing." The physician rushed to the fireplace, using the hot embers to heat a small copper kettle from his bag. Robert remained perfectly still in his chair, watching the fragile rise and fall of Bridget's chest. When the bitter, dark liquid was finally ready, the physician brought a small ceramic cup to the bed. He hesitated, unsure of how to lift the unconscious girl without hurting her further. Robert stood up, leaning over the bed to slide his massive hand beneath the back of Bridget's neck. He lifted her head gently from the silk pillows, supporting her weight entirely. The physician carefully pressed the cup to her dry lips, tipping the warm liquid into her mouth in slow, measured drops. Bridget coughed weakly, her face twisting at the bitter taste, but she swallowed the medicine. Robert lowered her back down to the pillows, using his thumb to wipe a stray drop of tea from her chin. His large, calloused hand lingered against her cheek for a long moment. He felt the fierce, stubborn pulse beating faintly beneath her jawline. She was fighting the illness with the same quiet, desperate strength she had used to survive the castle kitchens. The physician stepped back, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "We must wait for the sweat to break, Your Grace," the old man said quietly. "The next few hours will decide her fate." Robert nodded slowly, sinking back into the heavy wooden chair beside the bed. He did not dismiss the physician, and he did not seek out Lord William to finish the conquest. He simply crossed his heavy arms over his broad chest and prepared for a different kind of siege. The Iron Wolf had spent his entire life waging wars across the vast northern territories. He had conquered walled cities and commanded legions of heavily armed men. Yet, as he sat in the suffocating warmth of the usurper's bedchamber, staring at the fragile kitchen maid, he realized that the greatest battle he had ever fought was the one currently raging silently in the dark. He would sit in this chair until the dawn broke over the mountains, and he would not let the shadow of death cross the threshold of this room. The fire in the grand hearth eventually burned down to a pile of glowing red coals. The heavy shadows in the bedchambers stretched long and strange against the woven wall tapestries. King Robert did not close his eyes for a single moment throughout the grueling night. The old castle physician had fallen asleep in a cushioned chair near the doorway, utterly exhausted by fear and the late hour. The rest of the fortress outside the heavy oak doors was entirely silent. Lord William's remaining mercenary forces had surrendered the castle without a single sword being drawn in defiance. Once the captains realized the Iron Wolf was free and commanded the high tower, their false loyalty dissolved instantly. The news of the fallen sovereign's brutal return had spread through the dark corridors like a fast-burning oil fire. Yet Robert completely ignored the massive, historic shift of political power occurring just beyond the bedroom walls. His entire world was currently reduced to the shallow, rapid breaths of the small girl buried beneath the mountain firs. Around the 4th hour of the morning, a subtle, profound change occurred in the quiet room. Bridget's breathing shifted. The terrifying, dry rattle deep within her chest began to ease into a much smoother, quieter rhythm. Robert leaned forward immediately, his massive hands gripping the wooden armrests of his chair until the timber groaned under the pressure. He watched intently as a fine, gleaming sheen of sweat finally broke out across her pale forehead. The dangerous, unnatural flush on her sunken cheeks slowly began to fade, taking the lethal heat of the fever with it. The crisis had passed. The first pale, watery light of dawn breached the gap in the heavy velvet curtains a short time later. The violent pre-spring storm had finally moved on, leaving behind a cold, brilliantly clear sky over the jagged northern ridges. Bridget stirred slightly beneath the heavy layers of silk and animal fur. Her eyelids fluttered, feeling impossibly heavy, as if they were forged from solid lead. She opened her eyes very slowly, squinting blindly against the soft, completely unfamiliar morning light filling the large room. Her mind was entirely clouded, thick with the lingering, confusing fog of the poppy medicine and the breaking fever. She stared up at the massive, carved-in canopy situated high above her head, admiring the intricately decorated wooden hawks. She did not recognize the ceiling, nor the smell of burning cedar wood and expensive beeswax candles. For a brief, deeply peaceful moment, she truly thought she had simply died on her rotting straw pallet. She believed her suffering had ended, and she had passed into the merciful, warm halls of the old gods her mother used to sing about. There was absolutely no pain in her right knee, and the deep, bone-chilling cold of the courtyard was completely gone. She shifted her legs slightly, feeling the astonishing, impossible softness of the pristine silk sheets against her ruined skin. A sudden, sharp spike of sheer panic pierced straight through her lingering confusion. Kitchen maids who even accidentally touched the High Lord's fine linens were tied to the courtyard posts and whipped until they bled. She tried to sit up instantly, a desperate, raspy gasp escaping her dry, cracked lips. A massive shadow moved deliberately over the bed, completely blocking the harsh morning sunlight from her eyes. "Be still, little bird." A low, incredibly familiar voice commanded her gently. Bridget froze instantly, her wide, terrified eyes darting toward the side of the massive mattress. King Robert sat in the heavy wooden chair, looking like a mountain carved directly from the room's deep shadows. He had finally allowed a terrified servant to bring him a simple, clean black tunic during the night. However, his thick, muscular arms remained bare, openly exposing the heavy iron cuffs still tightly locked around his wrists. He looked incredibly tired, his piercing amber eyes slightly bloodshot from the long vigil. Yet there was a profound, striking calm resting over his scarred features that she had never seen in the iron cage. "Your Grace?" she whispered, her voice cracking painfully in her incredibly dry throat. Robert immediately reached for a heavy silver pitcher resting on a small, polished table beside the bed. He poured fresh, cool water into a goblet and brought it carefully to her lips. He slid his large, heavily calloused hand behind her neck, supporting her fragile weight effortlessly, just as he had done in the dark. She drank the water eagerly, the cool liquid instantly soothing the raw, burning ache in her throat. He pulled the silver goblet away smoothly when she had enough, resting her head gently back onto the soft silk pillows. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice slightly stronger now, but still thick with residual fear. "You are in the high tower," Robert answered plainly, setting the cup aside. "You are completely safe." Bridget looked around the opulent, staggering wealth of the room, her mind struggling to process the sheer, impossible reality of her situation. She vaguely remembered the freezing rain, the heavy steel skewer, and the terrifying, violent sound of cracking iron in the courtyard. After that, there was only a consuming darkness and the feeling of falling. "I did not finish my morning chores," she muttered instinctively, her dirty hands gripping the edge of the silk blanket in blind panic. "Mistress Martha will use the heavy rod on my back." Robert's heavy jaw tightened dangerously at the mere mention of the cruel head cook. A dark, brief flash of the furious iron wolf returned to his amber eyes, but he quickly and deliberately suppressed it for her sake. "Mistress Martha will never raise a hand to another living soul in this valley," Robert stated, his voice a low, absolute decree. "She was escorted out of the eastern gates at first light, along with the stable master and the guards who mocked you." He did not mention that they had been stripped of their warm winter cloaks and forced to walk the treacherous mountain path completely empty-handed. Bridget stared at him, entirely unable to comprehend the massive scale of the retribution he was describing. "And Lord William?" she asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, almost afraid to hear the answer. "He is currently occupying a damp, windowless cell in the lower dungeons," Robert replied, a grim, hard satisfaction lacing his deep words. "He is learning exactly how cold the stone floors of Blackrock Castle can truly be." Bridget looked down at her own hands, still rough, bruised, and heavily scarred from years of brutal, unrewarding labor. She did not understand why she was lying in this magnificent bed, or why the most feared king in the northern lands was sitting beside her. "I am just a scullery servant, Your Grace," she whispered, a deep, ingrained shame washing over her as she looked at the dirt on the sheets. "You should not be sitting here with me. You have an entire kingdom to reclaim and secure." Robert leaned closer, his massive elbows resting heavily on the edge of the soft mattress. He reached out slowly and gently, covered her small, scarred, trembling hands with his own massive one. "I had a grand kingdom built entirely on fear and loyalty, bought with heavy chests of coin," he said quietly. "It shattered into nothing the very moment a traitor offered my captains more gold than I possessed." He looked directly into her wide eyes, deliberately stripping away the high titles and the raw power that had defined his entire adult life. "I spent 3 agonizing months freezing in the mud, waiting blindly for an execution I believed I deserved." He paused, his rough thumb lightly and rhythmically tracing the bruised knuckles of her small hand. "You had absolutely nothing in this world, Bridget. Not a copper coin, nor a warm fire. Yet you actively risked the hangman's noose every single night to feed a dead man in the absolute dark." Bridget felt a strange hot pressure building rapidly behind her eyes. No one in her entire miserable life had ever spoken her name with such profound respect, let alone a sovereign king. "I could not let you starve," she murmured simply, looking at his scarred face as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. "And I cannot let you return to the shadows."
Robert countered immediately, his voice carrying the immovable, heavy weight of a royal oath. The brutal reign of the usurper is over, but the chained beast you saw in the courtyard is also dead, he told her. The man sitting before you now owes you his life, his restored sanity, and his entire future. He released her hands and sat back in the chair, his broad, heavy shoulders relaxing for the first time in countless days. You will never scrub another stone floor in this castle, he declared, his amber eyes burning with bright, absolute conviction. You will never carry boiling water for ungrateful lords, and you will never shiver in the dark again. Bridget let a single warm tear slip down her pale cheek, completely overwhelmed by the sheer terrifying magnitude of his promises. "What will I do then?" she asked nervously, genuinely unable to imagine a daily life without the brutal, punishing routine of the lower kitchens. Robert offered her a small, incredibly rare smile that completely transformed his harsh, intimidating features into something remarkably warm. "You will heal, little bird," he answered softly, the deep rumble of his voice offering profound comfort. "You will eat roasted meats at the high table with me, and you will wear fine wool thick enough to stop the bitter wind." He looked toward the high-arched window, where the bright morning sun was rapidly melting the last stubborn traces of snow off the stone battlements. "You will learn to read the ancient histories in the High Library, and you will sing whenever you wish to sing, not just to fight the dark." He looked back at her, his expression filled with a fierce, unwavering, and entirely pure protective loyalty. "You are my ward now, Budget of Blackrock. You are the very first true family this newly forged kingdom will ever know." Bridget closed her eyes, the very last of her deep-seated fears dissolving completely into the soft silk pillows beneath her head. Outside the heavy oak doors, the ancient stone castle was actively awakening to a completely new era of rule. The harsh, brutal winter of the northern valleys had finally, permanently broken. It had been chased away by the brave song of a little bird and the unbreakable, towering shadow of a restored king. To me, the most beautiful part of this story is that true strength isn't a sharp sword, but a tiny, brave spark of kindness in the dark. If you loved their journey, please hit that subscribe button. I'd also love to know where you're listening from today. Leave your city in the comments and say hi. And before you go, what should our next story be about? Drop your plot ideas below, and I'll see you in the next one.